I was listening here earlier today, and I had some problem because the loud was too high. Anyway, this is yet another talk about authorization. I remember when I started off in this business, I was at a conference in Manchester, and I think I heard 5 different presentations on network-based file systems. And there was NFS, XFS, and so forth. And this is the conference where you hear 4 different talks on 4 different types of authorization systems. So this is the 4th. I think it's the last one, though. Anyway, the background to this is not web. It came out of a work done with the Swedish Army. It had to do with how you managed the soldiers during battle and in peacetime. So it has nothing to do with web. That's the origin anyway. So this might be then some type of solution to non-web-based applications. Another thing was that one of the things we concentrated on when starting this work was that the military, the army, they wanted mathematical proof that this was a sound system, that there was no chance that someone was given permissions which they shouldn't have. So we had to prove that, theoretically. I haven't seen any proof that Shibboleth does that or that the other authorization system does that, but we had to do that. So, and the title of this was the 3rd step. This is sort of the first step, from my point of view anyway, was that you have a common information service, which is the directory, which this session is supposed to be about, but it's only 1/3 of it. It might be an LDAP directory, but you shouldn't build something which is where you have that kind of limitation. That's my point of view, even though I worked with LDAP since when it started in the early 90s. Above that, you have this common authentication service, which might be something based on X509 or something else. But it doesn't really matter again. There's something you have to standardize on in your own environment. And then on top of that, you have to have some kind of common, well, you don't have to have, but I would say that you will benefit from having a common authorization service. Oh, that was a bit small. No, anyway, the characteristics of this, of course, first you have to have something where you have accountability. You have to know who did something. And that's usually by using logs. But another thing is that suppose you have a person who has, in these role-based systems, they can use several different roles. Now, when they did something, which role were they using? Because in some instances, that's very important, that you can log that kind of information. It's not something you can do in all systems. Another thing was to allow delegation. So this should actually be a system where you can delegate authorities. And you would also want a system where you can set limits on the delegation. For instance, the military headquarters in Sweden, which is in Stockholm, is the access to that facility is managed by a commercial company. And those guys, they are not allowed inside the building, sort of. But they are those who is managing the access to the building as such. So you would like to have the possibility to say that, okay, this guy who is the boss of the military in the army in Sweden, he can delegate to this commercial company to sort of do the authentication of persons who want to enter this facility. But they shouldn't be able to delegate this to anyone else, for instance. Not even to the military themselves. So this system should be, you should be able to do that with this system. Again, asserting that no one receives permission that she shouldn't have. And we had to provide a mathematical proof for that. We want to distribute the administration to have the possibility of doing that. It should be network-based, though when it comes to the military side again, there is no certainty that you will have a network at all. You might have in peacetime, and as soon as you have some kind of war going on, quite certainly you won't have one network. You will have islands. And how should this system should still work in that environment. We ought to have a simple and extensible policy description language. So it shouldn't be tightly coupled to sort of defining a couple of roles and what the roles could do. It should be more extensible than that. The system should use available information infrastructure, not specifically LDAP or anything like that. It could be a relational database. It could be any kind of information system, text file, whatever. And another thing that you actually don't think about the first time you try to do something like that is that you should be able to override this stuff. And where that came from was we were working with a hospital in Sweden with this system. And there you have very strict rules about who is allowed to read this documentation about patients. And it's even so that the patients are, according to new laws, can decide themselves who are allowed to see their documents, the documents that describe sort of the problems they have been through and all that kind of stuff. But in an emergency situation, you might want to override that because you want to know that for certainty that this person doesn't have a problem with certain kind of medications, for instance. So, if you have the possibility to override this, then of course you have to log that in a very specific way, so you know that someone has really done something which is out of the ordinary. System configuration, again, this is not something new. This is sort of what you have seen all the time. You have the applications on one side. Actually, it's on this side. I have it on that side. And you have a common application interface to the policy server from those. On that side, you have the information resources, which can be any type of information resources. And you have an application, you have an interface in those too. And then you have the administration interface. So this is sort of the system configuration. Right. And this is, I should say that too, in this context, that I've been working with this policy server now for almost a year. Well, actually, it's almost exactly a year. And now from Saturday, was it? The 1st of June. I'm now working in a project which involves a couple of universities in Sweden, the NRN in Sweden and Norway, to build some sort of common authorization system, which is then based to a large extent on the work I have been doing this last year with the policy server. So even though I've implemented this actually twice, I'm not going to demo anything today. I'm sorry it comes out so small in fonts. Actually, they should have been bigger than that. But anyway, behind it all is S expressions. I don't know many people who knows what S expressions are, but those who have done something in computer science knows what Lisp is, and this is sort of the same. S expression was also used in the SPKI work within the IETF. So even though that work didn't really go anywhere, we are sort of picking up on their work on S expressions and going further. S expression has two types of elements. There are atoms from lists, and lists contains then of atoms and or other lists. And what was used in SPKI, and also we are using, is that if you add more items to a list, it's the same as making the expression more specific. It's like if you have a directory system. If you add another item at the end, like if you start off with country and then you have organization unit, and so forth, each time you add something, you get more specific. This is the same thinking. Anyway, this together with one other limitation we have put to S expression, and that is that every list should have a first element which is a tag, which is a unique identifier for that specific type of list. Using this, we can actually mathematically prove that you can compare two S expressions and you can say that one S expression is sort of more specific or equally specific as the other. And that's all we have to know. And it doesn't matter what the S expressions represent. That's outside sort of the whole computation. So the policy server in this case just looks at S expressions. It doesn't bother about what they are representing. They're just comparing S expression and sort of deciding whether one is less or equal than the other, more specific or equally specific than the other. That's all it does. So anyway, a policy then is usually, do we normally express as an actor and an action? And this is the kind of thing you can see one can do with this language. And you can use more basis for your discussion than just roles. In this case, we can say that specific time limits. You can say that the authorization method used has to be certificate-based. It has to be X509, for instance, which then should be different from using password and user ID and that kind of things. You can specify that you want only to accept a query. You will also only say that this is allowed if the query comes from someone who sits at a machine who has an IP address in that specific range. And further, you can say, well, okay, we will put in role there too. And this is just a small, you can easily, I think, imagine sort of putting other type of restrictions in there. And in this case, the action as such is that printing is allowed on this printer. You're allowed to use this protocol to access this printer. So again, it has nothing to do with web. I hope I got your thinking now. So I think I will stop there, which is precisely on time. Because anyway, so I hope now that you have some thoughts about this, and got some thoughts about this, and some background so you can ask questions. Because I assume this is quite new to you. Any questions? You're astounded. Gosh.
No, we have one. Ton.
Ton. I know I can count on you.
Well, one question at least is how you connect the authentication phase to the authorization phase to the application of the policy.
Let's see if I can go back. We have I should have mentioned that. The authentication you do, you use against the application. So it's the application who decides on what kind of authentication you have. This gives the application some kind of information who is asking. And it can use that information and other type of information it has to post a query to the policy server, whether this actor is allowed to do this action. And then the policy server answers yes or no, but there is also a third alternative which might be yes, but there are further restrictions which has to be fulfilled before this user can use this. So there is there was someone, the previous speaker here also said that authentication, that's already done in some way. And that's also our point of view, that authentication is done in the application. But that gave the application some kind of information which is then used to go further.
Anybody with any other questions? Yes.
To me, it's nice to see so much about authentication authorization. And what strikes me is that it's clean, and that's good. But I worked in a computer center, and I know that nobody wants to work clean because they want to do it quick and they want to do it dirty. So, do you have a solution for a very clean structure that people in practice want to use quick?
You can complicate this a lot, or you can make it rather simple. And I would say that so far, actually, what I've been doing this last year is make very simple things, where in fact you pull in the information resources into the policy server. That gives you the possibility to build software which is sort of self-contained. You can very easily configure it. You can sort of add the information you want to, and off you go. It's extremely simple. We are not really sure where we will end up. We are sort of in this design phase right now for what kind of functionality we are going to build. But that's at one end of the spectrum. And I'm very glad that you mentioned this is simple, because I'm for the lean and mean solutions to things. And this is no XML, this is no HTML, and so forth. No SOAP. It's something that works, and it's provable that it's going to work. Good ending note.
One more.
Except for Bob.
I think, we're all for simplicity. I would say that we've managed to convince the world that that simplicity is possible in authentication, I guess, by saying that we all have a user ID and we just use that user ID. But the problem with policy, of course, is that the policymakers refuse to let it be simple. They put in all kinds of extra conditions. So, in some sense, I guess, I think a measure of effectiveness, one kind of effectiveness in the policy language is how much it lets the policymakers express their complexity while somehow, making it at least visible. Is that something you've tried to achieve here, or you think you are hoping to edge up on? Or?
No, absolutely. I mean, this. If you look at this, I think everyone can understand what it says. And this is sort of, in some way, readable, or it's very easily displayed to someone so they can understand. But at the same time, if you use something like S expression, you can make it so complicated that you have very little chance of understanding what you've really done. So I would say that it's much a matter of administration interfaces here.
Well, I think you and I can look at that and think that it's simple. I suspect that the person who actually administers policy in my office would see a whole bunch of stars and parentheses.
Right. But I would assume that
may be better than seeing angle brackets. But
okay. No, I would assume that the administrative interface that they actually are using is not displaying something like this to them. They're actually displaying like pop-up boxes and lists of where you can define dates, for instance, and you get to pick the sort of the starting date and the end date and so forth, and lots of choices.
Right. Although even there, you can make an argument that the user might want to sort of look at the result of that,
right,
and somehow have it be understandable, but hard to do.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Roland, thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Ken Klingenstein, and he's going to be presenting on Internet 2 middleware and the NSF Middleware Initiative, the initials being NMI. Ken is project director of the Internet 2 Middleware Initiative. He coordinates activities intended to build an interoperable middleware infrastructure among I2 members. He's on loan to Internet 2 from the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he was Director of Information Technology Services for 14 years and continues to serve as Chief Technologist for the campus. Keith Hazelton, myself, Bob Morgan, we all have the wonderful, rare privilege of working with Ken. As you hear him speak, know he is not from another country. He is originally from Brooklyn. That's just his accent. Ken, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I hope my Brooklyn brogue is intelligible to all of you for whom English is not the native tongue. It isn't the native tongue for me either. Brooklyn is. And so, much as other people have extended a greeting in their native tongue, I want to do the same. So, yo! I want to talk about two activities today. The Internet 2 Middleware Initiative, which we started several years ago, and which received a real boost last year when we were one of the 2 awardees from the National Science Foundation for what's called the NSF Middleware Initiative. Our co-awardee in this grant was a grid center project, and I'll be borrowing a few slides from their presentation to talk about their work in the NMI as well. At the end, I will try to tie the 2 threads of our work and their work together, because that is our real job, is to tie these threads together. One other comment, we always walk a line between trying to be busy and trying to be effective. Sometimes we're more busy than we are effective. I hope we're effective in the long run. So I want to begin with the Internet 2 Middleware Overview and some of our activities, and then go into the NSF Middleware Initiative, and then discuss the integration issues. This is how we tend to see the world. We are very enterprise-oriented. We see the security domain that you live in as your primary repository of information about you, as your primary locus for authentication, your primary authorization space, the facilitator of your desktop operations. So we work on the plane of desktop across campus infrastructure. Rising from that plane, there are vertical niches that represent the disciplines and their use of the core middleware. So you'll see in the centerpiece there is the grid center, the distributed computation environment, and on top of that, individual science areas and individual experiments within those science areas build their vertical environments in chemistry and physics, etc. You'll see digital libraries. It's a very important space rising out of the core middleware. Academic computing upperware to us is embodied in learning management systems, such as WebCT and OKI. It's also embodied in portals. You'll see some other areas where we're also working. And then off on the left-hand side of this plane, you'll see places where there are applications which we think are going to be widely used, perhaps even killer apps, and we want to engage those into the core enterprise environment. So, for example, we see a world where desktop video conferencing gets its authentication and authorization services from the enterprise. Clearly, for most of us, we live in more than one security domain. We have a professional security domain, and we may have a personal security domain. And that's okay. We can all handle 2 or 3 different persona. We nurture that on occasion. I'll just make one comment about what we see as network layer middleware. I'll give you 2 examples of that. The first is secure multicast, where you'd want to leverage the authentication and authorizations from your enterprise. Secure multicast is very hard. Multicast is hard. Security is hard. Put them together and it's very hard. So we don't do it. We'll get there eventually, we hope. A second network layer middleware service is quality of service, QoS. Again, would want to leverage your local environment. And I started a conversation with Fred Baker yesterday about maybe we should go back to directory-enabled networking now that we have directories. And Fred said, you mean directory-disabled networking, and I agreed. So this is the world as we see it, and inside core middleware we have a number of components that we work in. Currently, the major areas which we're pushing are identity and identifiers. Creating namespaces that are unique, doing identifier crosswalks. This is a very important problem which we have to address very soon. In one environment, you're known as Tan, and in another environment, you may be known as Nancy. How is that identifier map made? This is coming up in the grid space a lot, where we've developed a tool called KX509 that turns a Kerberos ticket into a temporary certificate for use within the grid. There's a small problem. The Kerberos ticket has your campus identity in it. The 509 certificate is supposed to have your grid identity in it. Where is this match made? Is it made at the origin, at the security domain? Is it made at the resource? The answer is both. When do you use which one? We don't have that nailed yet. Another thing involved in identity and identifiers are real-world levels of assurance that you see heavily in PKI. We're working in authentication spaces, campus technologies and policies, both. I think one aspect of middleware is that it's the place where technology and policy come together. We're talking about inter-realm interoperability services. We're doing a lot of work in directories. As you've heard, we're doing a lot of work in authorization. And then we're trying to integrate this with other projects that work in virtual organizations in particular, such as the grids. And so we see the world as having 3 different trust fabrics to develop. Hierarchical trust fabrics, such as what PKI develops, perhaps global hierarchies, if we can figure out how to do bridges, federations, and virtual organizations. And one characteristic of a virtual organization is that it probably does not hand out primary security credentials. It probably does not contain primary directory information. It wants to get those from either the enterprise or from some global hierarchy. How do we make that work? We're not an academic exercise. We have to make this happen. And I think we are noted by our aggressive, if occasionally stupid, and bullheaded approaches. But I think we've had many years of deep thought about this and not as much practice, and the practice will be revealing, and so we're driving things into practice. We want to solve real-world policy issues. We want to make sure applications use this infrastructure. We'd like this to be open source where possible. We want this to scale. And on occasion, we will actually invent tools. Most of what we want to do is is nurture consistency between environments, but we've been inadvertently creating tools along the way. A couple of key concepts in our work. Federated administration. It is the lever. We are all employed by universities or by national labs. That's the place where things begin. We want to provide security, but we do not want to degrade privacy. Privacy, one begins with privacy, one loses it successively in steps. We do not want to begin that degradation. We want to provide inter-realm trust fabrics that work not only legally, but for collaborative environments. And in collaboration, our trust is anchored with a handshake, not with a contract. Our trust relationships come and go fairly frequently. And they need to be nimble. And no one has ever used the word nimble with PKI. So we need to make sure that we create trust fabrics that work. We want to leverage campus expertise. We believe in rough consensus and running code. And we'd like to influence the marketplace. We'd like to influence Microsoft. We really are fools. The areas that we're working in, we work general middleware. We make sure there's a sales pitch for campuses. And we have a number of documents out there on our websites that are business plans, because you're going to need your legacy systems to participate. You're going to need your owners of data to share them. You're going to, at one awkward moment, switch the flow of information from the legacy systems feeding the directory to suddenly the directory has better information than the legacy systems, and the flow goes the other way. That's when you know you've won. So we have those sales pitches that are available for all. We're doing a lot of work in directories. I will not cover that. Keith is going to cover that shortly. We're doing a lot of work in Shibboleth. Bob covered that quite well before. We're working in PKI. Peter Alterman talked earlier today about the Higher Ed Bridge Certificate Authority, and Michael and others are key in that. I want to focus a little bit on two of the pieces that haven't been covered of video on demand and federated video conferencing. This is a list, by the way, of some of our PKI activities. We held a research conference a number of weeks ago. Alan, among others, attended. A very interesting conference. Showed a lot of new opportunities in PKI. Some exciting work from Dan Bonet, for example, on using your email address as an encryption key for signed email. Very interesting work, very nimble materials. That's the URL for the conference. We urge people to go to it. Our challenge is to take some of those ideas and test them out in the real world. We're working a lot in digital rights management. And we believe, as Larry Lessig said yesterday, that the debate has not been shaped correctly. We see three different kinds of digital right management problems. There is the personal use of digital rights of digital materials. That's the one that Hollywood's focusing on. You pay to see it, you pay to see it again, and you're not allowed to mutate it, you're not allowed to cut out of it, and they know who you are, who's viewing it, and you will get lots of mailings following that saying, if you like this movie, you'll like that movie. But we really want to focus on professional use, where your security domain, your campus or your lab has purchased bulk materials or acquired bulk materials and wants to disseminate them to you as a member of your community, and the issues are now different. The issues include privacy. The issues include you're entitled to take a 15-second video clip from this newscast and stick it into your term paper. How do we enable that capability? So we believe the professional use, the academic use of digital materials has not been addressed, and our work is in this space. There is also, by the way, a third use of digital materials also getting neglected, at least in the United States, the public use. As a citizen, you are entitled to information. How do we secure that? How do we make sure there's privacy involved in that as well? So we believe this is a miscast discussion, and we're, again, as the patron saints of hopeless causes, trying to involve ourselves in this work. So as the digital rights technologies that we want to look at are driven by these different uses of online materials. And they're going to, the requirements will differ about privacy, economic recovery methods, needs and controls for security, and we want to be involved in that process. Another area where we're working heavily is in the desktop video space in particular, and as well as in the video on demand space. The VidMid VC group, led by Egon Verhoorn from SurfNet, has a number of conspicuous players and is doing quite aggressive work in trying to add resource discovery, directory infrastructure, and authorization and authentication to desktop video. We'd like it to be that when you initiate a desktop video conference, you do that not with some arcane long string of digits, but you click on someone's name. At the receiver side, we'd like it to be that today in video conferencing, I open a port on my machine, and then I'm at the mercy of whatever's going to come up on that port. And it could be some part of somebody's anatomy showing up on that screen. We call this the denial of decency attack. We want to prevent this. What we want is a pop-up window to say, excuse me, but Tan Verschoren wants to video conference with me, and SurfNet attests that it's really Tan. Do you want to accept that video conference? Of course. And the video conference would begin. So those are some of our target goals in that space. And as I alluded to earlier, it's very hard. These protocols are not designed to carry good forms of authentication. Many of these protocols, 323, Access Grid, VRVS, SIP, presume that there's going to be a PKI infrastructure in place later today, maybe tomorrow, not happening quickly. And so we'd like it to make it independent of the credentialing mechanism. So we've worked very hard at this. It's been very resistant. We are about to perhaps do a bailout and say, for the time being, let's make this a web app because we know how to do this. We think with web apps. The wrong direction in the long term, but it could be a compelling case to invest more in this. We have lots of vendors in this space. The video on demand work is looking at some of the digital rights management I described before. One of the things we've learned is focus is essential in this, and so we have a number of items that we are not dealing with today. Security cameras. Are they desktop video conferencing? Are they video on demand? What are the privacy issues? We're not going to address that, at least not for a while. So I want to turn to the NSF Middleware Initiative, and I want to begin by discussing a little bit about what the grid is doing in this space. And I may need some help in pulling up the presentation. What? Alt tab. Okay, thank you. I can probably handle it from here. So this is the grid center work as part of the NMI, and I borrowed these slides from Ian Foster. Thank you, Ian. And they were used at an NMI review that was conducted about 4 weeks ago. And I think the good news is that we seem to have passed the review. We seem to be receiving funds for years 2 and 3. In fact, the review panel suggested that we get additional funds, which means we're either not doing a good job and they want us to speed up, or this is a reward. But it was a positive review. These are the grid center's participants. ISI is handling much of the directory work. The University of Chicago is handling some of the scheduling work, I believe. And then NCSA is the lead on the security pieces. San Diego Supercomputing Center is doing much of the packaging. The packaging is very important if this is going to be easy to install. And the University of Wisconsin is doing the testing of this. The grid center goal is to define an integrated, modular, and extensible architecture that will provide what we see in the I2 space as upper middleware for the scientific and engineering communities. The packages should be robust and documented, and they want to evolve this over time. In particular, they're doing production quality software releases. They are expanding the environments this will work in, and they're providing a dedicated operations center for 24/7 support. But I'll point out a gap here between what we're doing and what they're doing. They are monitoring the grid resources, but they're not monitoring the end-to-end performance. They don't monitor the network piece. This is a place where we need to step forward and work together in an integrated environment so that the users can have one diagnostic space. We had release 1 of NMI on May 7th. I'll provide the website at the end of this talk. The grid software that was included was Globus and Condor and Network Weather Service. We supplied the KX509 software and KCA that I described earlier that produces short-term certificates from Kerberos tickets. The Grid Center in future years will continue to expand the core release. They're going to address some more of the campus integration issues. For example, should there be a grid person object class? If so, how does it relate to an edu-person object class? How will virtual organizations register in life? Issues like that. Another major trend in the grid space over the next 2 years, as many of you know, is the open grid services architecture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the integration piece. I think one of the concerns that came up in the review of our work was persistence. We are funded on a 3-year cycle. What's going to happen to grid development at the end of that process? What's going to happen to Internet 2 middleware development at the end of that process? Well, Internet 2 started before this grant, as did the grid, so perhaps we'll continue after this grant, but perhaps there'll be a vehicle for continued federal support in this. So the idea of extending the release as well is part of the grid space. And in closing, I'll just mention that the OGSA is a very important piece. And when I talk about integration, it's probably the place in the future that we'll meet in. So here is the schedule for OGSA. OGSA will not replace the Globus toolkit. It will augment the Globus toolkit in Ian's view. And that work is already underway. I believe there's going to be a number of white papers about OGSA emerge in the next 2 weeks. No. Okay. Oh, it goes real fast. There we go. Thank you. It goes faster than I do. So the other team in the NMI work is the EDIT Consortium. That's the Internet 2 collaboration, along with EDUCAURS, who's primary on outreach. And we are doing a test bed process with the Southeastern Universities Research Association. Our plan is to make this happen on the campuses. We want to develop a campus infrastructure on every campus. We want to make sure that infrastructure is consistent between campuses. So, for example, we have EduPerson as the outward facing piece of a campus directory. We want to build tools where we need to. We want to support grids. We want to support digital libraries. And we want to support other kinds of collaborative technologies as well. And lastly, we want to ensure that the distinctive higher ed requirements, from privacy to academic freedom to multi-realm portals, are served in the marketplace. Our processes, which Keith may describe a little bit more, include endless phone calls, which many of you participate in. The phone calls produce drafts. The drafts then get circulated to a wider group. And the processes seem to take about 4 to 6 months to produce a standard. That's not bad. It's not a standard. To produce a recommendation. I won't go into the space of legalisms associated with standards, but we feel we can be very effective with rough consensus and running code. I think one thing that surprised us is the amount of involvement. There are many, many schools involved in this. There are gems that emerge from some small universities. It is staff retention for many people. We take our documents from works in progress. When we're done with the working group work on that, we call it experimental. We invite all of the higher ed community to comment. They do. We go back to the working group, we modify. When we're done with that stage, we create something called Released for Public Review, kind of akin to RFC. And then we invite the entire world to comment on that. And then at the end of it, we have a final blob, where blob could be standard, could be a recommendation, but we're done. We have lots of participants, lots of corporate participants, lots of government participants. We are working closely with a number of organizations like JISC, Red Iris. Interestingly, the Australians are very active in this space as well. We got our grant on September 1. We finalized EduPerson a month later. We worked with the HEBCA. We won a couple of awards. We shipped Alpha Shib. And we did this PKI workshop. We've done the NMI release now. And as Keith will talk about, we'll do some affiliated directories. These camps are meetings for campus architects to get together and talk geek. The specific deliverables in NMI Release 1 included these pieces of software, KX509 we've talked about. Certificate Profile Maker was donated by NEC Japan. It gives you the ability to create certificate profiles in a number of different formats by just using a nice user interface saying, I want my revocation period to be so-and-so, I want my extensions to be so-and-so, and then automatically generates a profile. PubCookie came out of the University of Washington. It is a web initial sign-on product. It is consistent with the Shibboleth environment. In fact, over time, PubCookie, the next generation, will begin to look more and more as a part of Shibboleth. We've done a number of object classes. Keith will talk about that. We did a number of best practices. Michael was heavily involved and is the primary author on the LDAP recipe. It's become a legendary work on how a campus can develop a directory. We've done a lot of work in groups recently. Groups are fascinating concepts. Group math is interesting stuff. That's in here as well. I'll skip over the policy pieces and the works in progress, which are largely in the video space. Here is our vision of how other folks can participate in NMI. As a user, you can follow. As a developer, you can engage. In terms of the outreach, we've reached 117 universities so far in the U.S. We're continuing to be very aggressive. We are frankly surprised at how willing higher ed is to adopt standards. We used to be cats and go in different directions, but I believe Internet One activities have convinced us that consistency is useful and has helped this level of interaction. And we have a number of non-usual suspects in there. I'll skip over the plans coming up, except at the end of July, we're having a very interesting workshop you're invited to attend in Boulder, Colorado. It's an advanced camp. We will be looking at the 3-tier problem, the portal problem that was alluded to, and we won't be solving it. But we'll certainly hammer at it. I'll skip over the test beds, except this is the place where the rubber meets the road. We want to make sure that this works. The test beds will be the places where we can see if the grids and the edit work will integrate. Let me just stop there for a second. Notice these websites. These are the places where you can go and obtain more information. You can just Google on NMI and you'll find us. What are we going to do next year? Authorization, authorization, authorization. It's just the issue of the day, as Alan said. And we don't mean to say that we're going to do it once. We're going to do it 3 times because one size won't fit all. But we're going to try to make it relate. We're going to try to make the authorization services in Globus interact with the authorization services on campuses. We're going to continue to push along with Shibboleth and PKI. We're going to focus on the integration issues. The affiliated directories, et cetera, will come along, and Keith will describe that. Here are some of the deliverables which we're intending to deliver over the next year. You can judge us by how much slippage there is. I hate to put our feet in concrete. No, I love to put our feet in concrete. By the way, there will be a second PKI research conference coming up in April. This was one of the slides I included in the review, and I wanted to bring it in front of this audience because it's very relevant. There are major gaps in how we're going to internationalize our work. We never intended our work to be international. But there are vacuums which we seem to be filling. If we're going to do that way, then we need international participation in this work. We have people like Peter and Ton and Brian participating in this stuff. We need more involvement. Because the grids that are going to use this are clearly international in scope. Moreover, we don't know if international trust structures are going to involve governments or whether my university and a university in England will set up a trust structure that won't flow through our governments. 3 years ago, we knew the answer was going to be it was going to flow through our governments. That didn't happen. What's the answer today? We don't know. The last issue I want to cover is integration. We understand somewhat the technical issues in integrating our work with the grid's work, but we have to make it a high priority for both groups. If the grid listed their 10 most important items for next year, we wouldn't be in that list, integrating with the campuses possibly. If we listed our 10 most important items, the grid integration may not be high in that list. But if you combine the two, it's clearly number one. But how do we get the time to focus on that? That's a management challenge that I have not been equal to, that Ian has not been equal to. We have to make that work. There are more gaps than there is overlap. We talk about the plumbing. We provide pipe. They provide fixtures. In many cases, there is 18 inches that is left to the reader, left to the user. Most of these users cannot do that. It's water on the floor if we can't do this. We don't understand the policy issues in this space at all, and how the governments interact, etc. What needs integration? Well, I think we have to challenge ourselves to understand, is it security credentials? Is it directory services? Or maybe the example which has come forward most recently is maybe those things don't have to integrate, but accounting does. Because the equipment that the grid uses is not owned by the scientists. It's owned by CERN. It's owned by my campus. And my campus wants to see accounting in the fashion that it does accounting. So the grid scientists may want to know how many hours do I have left on this resource. But the resource owner wants to know, give me a list of the resource users, their nationalities, etc., etc. So we need to make this work, we believe, at the campus level for accounting as well. We'd like to make this easy for the user and easy for the behind the scenes. What are the barriers to integration? We all have embedded bases that are different priorities and gaps. And so our plan has been that we're going to coexist at first and integrate later. And so our coexistence has been around Kerberos tickets to 509 certificates, doing the test beds, and thinking a little bit about this identifier crosswalk problem. Where we need to work together in the integration spaces around web services and meta directories, reducing the number of identifiers that you have and making the accounting integrate. Just want to close and say that I think we're beginning to see the emergence of what the second layer of network connectivity will look like. I think we begin to see how in 3 to 5 years there will be a common middleware infrastructure across members of the R&E community internationally. We're going to have campus infrastructure that's consistent. It will work together between the realms, and it will support upperware like the grids and digital libraries. So I think we're closer, even as the margin and the horizon unfolds farther and farther away. Thank you. Questions? Too long.
Thank you, Ken. Unfortunately, due to lack of time, I'm going to ask that you hold questions for Ken until the end. Our next speaker is Keith Hazelton. Keith will be speaking to us about recent issues in directories in Internet 2 middleware, and I think Ken gave a number of referrals to what Keith will be discussing. Keith is a senior IT architect at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a member of the Network Applications Consortium. He's also a member of the Internet 2 Middleware Committee for Education, MACE, and chairs the MACE-DIR working group, the directory working group. Also is a member of the NetEdu PKI working group, which is where things like the higher ed bridge are worked on as well. I will also note that Keith is responsible for crafting the agreement with a company called MetaMerge, which gave us that product to higher education worldwide. So if you're not aware of MetaMerge, you have access to it. If you are an institution of higher education, metamerge.com. Keith.
Thanks, Michael. My family and I want to thank Terena and the program committee for Terena, the hosts, for this wonderful setting. We're having a great time here. Last night we were out about 11 p.m., I think it was, and the skies in the northwest, the clouds were still pink. And I think we've timed this session so that just about the time we end, if you go outside, you can see this amazing phenomenon for yourselves. So I hope you enjoy that. All right? We've got a few things that we'd like to say about the directory work, including why I think it's slipping to the end of the agenda, and even speakers that are supposed to talk about it don't anymore. But, but the things we are going to review here are essentially what we did recently and things that we've taken up and try to get done in the next section of time. And Ken has previewed some of this. We'll say a little about the various edu whatever object class that we've done. Delve a little bit into the work we've done in the area of groups in directories, and a nod to Michael for inclusion of some of that in the LDAP recipe, version 2. Some notes on the affiliated directories, and a little introduction to a group that we've gotten formed finally here called the Technical Advisory Board for MASTEER, or the TAB group. On the EduPerson object class, we had a 1.0 version that many of you know about, and we did some work to update that, fix a few things, including some things that made it less suitable internationally. It's still very much a US-centric thing, but it did improve some of the problems with 1.0. And it was included, as Ken said, in this release 1.0 of the NMI on May 7th. EduPerson 1.0 is the official final production version of things today, but 1.5 is out there now as RPR, or Released for Public Review. So this is an invitation to look at the URLs at the end of these presentations and go have a look at that, try it out in your systems, and let us know, because our next round, next release under NMI will hopefully include a final and improved version of EduPerson 1.5 based on what we hear from people. Just to highlight a couple things about this EduPerson 1.5, we added one more attribute in a group of attributes, and there are now 3 that include org or org unit distinguished names. The one we added at the suggestion of Matthias Meisfjordskar at the University of Oslo is the EduPerson primary org unit DN. The EduPerson org unit DN is a multi-valued attribute. This gives you a way at your institution, if you so choose, to kind of say this is the org unit that is home to these people, or again, it's an institutional level decision. You get to decide what primary means and let people know, but that attribute is out there. The more general use attribute that we came up with in this round of enhancements is EduPerson entitlement. And the basic notion is many of the attributes that currently exist, both from the person, org person, and on up, are attributes about the person, things like their address or their name. As we've seen in the authorization theme going on here, very often what you'd rather do, or what's more appropriate to the situation, not all situations, but to many, is that what you'd really like to know is this person that's knocking on my cyberspace door entitled to see my resource? And so the logic goes, and we've seen this from work in JISC and so forth, why don't you just carry the fact that this person is entitled? Now, of course, that makes you nervous because you say, gee, I'm the resource provider, and I'm supposed to take this statement over the net that this person is entitled to see my resource. It sounds really like there's some broken security aspect there. But if you think about it, let's say that access to the resource was controlled by an assertion by the party out there that this person is a faculty member in the medical school. Ultimately, you're trusting them to say only true things, and what's your recourse if they start giving these things that are only supposed to go to medical school faculty to others? Well, you have to go to the courts or, change the licensing terms next time around. The same thing applies here. So you've got to have some other mechanism to establish that there are recourses if this is misused, but it is nice to be able to put into the directory for that person just a statement of entitlement. And we specify in the spec here that it can be either a URL or a URN, meaning that if you put in a URL, it may not be that that's an actual website that you can go look at, but it's a nice way to specify a unique thing that a community of people that care about some resource and providing access to it can agree on, and put this as an attribute on the person, allow for federated administration, and then people can get access based on this. It's also, by using URLs and URNs, you allow for sort of decentralized creation of values for the EduPerson entitlement attribute without worrying about clashes there. If you go strictly with the URL, yes, it's theoretically very possible to come up with a clash, but we have this other approach, which is that MACE has an internet draft currently with the URN working group within IETF to get a URN designation, URN:MACE. And then the MACE group of Internet 2 will essentially act as the top level naming authority for that prefix and can assign branches underneath it to subordinate naming authorities. And ultimately, then you get a way to create, among other things, you could just label whole documents with this format of URNs, but in this particular case, you can use it to create values for the EduPerson entitlement. And then, again, you don't have to worry as long as you're using your branch of the naming tree. I just put some, with the dashed bullets there, references in case you're, don't have right on the tip of your tongue the URN, URI, URL distinction business, but URNs are always URN:, and then some namespace identifier, and ours is hopefully, if it's approved, MACE. The middle red bullet there talks about a hypothetical example where what MACE has done, say, is assign someone at Brown University to be in charge of the MACE namespace for Brown University. And then Brown University can create at their pleasure URNs underneath that. So if they create a foo that's from Brown University under the MACE authority, guess what? They can then use that for whatever they want. If they're in a coalition or collaborative work with other universities, they could agree on the meaning within that community. If you are interested in more information about that, there is an email address there that we're using as kind of the way for people to self-nominate as possible naming authorities under that. The whole point, though, is it gives you a way to create values for the EduPerson entitlement attribute and play around with this notion of asserting entitlements as opposed to asserting facts or attributes about people. The other object class we put out there in an experimental form using the terminology of the NMI world is edu.org to hold organizational objects. Of course, X521 did a fine job of defining organization and organizational unit. But just as with person and org person and INET.org person, there are some things we thought the educational community might want to do as well. Plus, we might want to remind ourselves or agree on some details about the meaning of the attributes that came from X520. And there are three basic groups that are relevant for organizations, many of which are also relevant for people, but there's a telecommunications set of attributes, a postal, and a locale set of attributes. The only things we layered on top of this, we've always kind of kept to a minimalist perspective in our schema work, at least for this edu-wide approach to things, are these URIs of various things of interest. So it gives you a standard way in your directory tree to represent where the home page, the URL probably for the university, things like what's for the edu.org, what's the superior, an LDAP URL probably that would point to the superior entity. In case of University of Wisconsin-Madison, we might acknowledge that there's a University of Wisconsin statewide system that thinks they're in charge of us, so we would probably put that in there. Put in a white pages URI for your LDAP directory and so forth. My last bullet on this slide is really to say that it's my firm feeling that the schema work at the edu level is going to continue to taper off. The people that are doing that are going to move on to other things, and I suspect some of those will be authorization related, or maybe group or affiliated directory related. But I think it's revealing that the work in this space is now shifting more to communities of interest, say such as the Shibboleth pilot sites, the parties to that, the resource providers and the universities accessing those materials. That, to my mind, is typical of the locus of work. It'll probably be less than the edu scope. Some of these may grow back to the edu space, and then things could be promoted. That would be fine. The work in the COM object class, where, again, some of the MACE directory working group folks, such as Michael and have gone off and helped with that effort, is in some ways a new territory for this, where the elements are COM objects. And all we do to the person element is both eduperson and eduorg are auxiliary object classes, meaning you can put in attributes for them or not. There are no required ones. The COM object specifies that for person entries, for example, you can have a COM object URI in the resource or the hardware side of things that would point back to the object that's associated with it. And so there's some linkage there between it, but I suspect very strongly that we're kind of finishing this up. So even the person here that's talking about directories has kind of got one foot out the door, if you want to think of it that way. I think that's a good thing. That's kind of saying that we've agreed on a lot of things about directories generally now. And those are stabilizing somewhat, kind of solidifying like so much magma. And we're now starting to be able to think about the authorization things. I think maybe authentication and directories are somewhat at a comparable point in terms of evolution in our thinking. We've got those interoperable problem statements at least. And so the attention moves on up, and that's I think, natural and good. Groups and directories document and the work there has been under Tom Barton at the University of Memphis as editor. There's a document out there on practices that's in the released for public review status. And he does, as Ken hints, talk about, based on conversations with any number of universities and partners, issues that come up when you try to do what I would, this is unfair, but poor man's RBAC, that is, putting groups in the directories in various ways to represent roles or memberships in some organizational branch. I think the one thing that would help you understand the general approach is that we're believers in flat and bushy kinds of trees, and therefore we're not really likely to be big believers in creating highly branched out DITs for representing organizational or group stuff. That creates problems we'd rather deal with other ways. So instead, we spend more time thinking about, how do we carry that information in attributes or in group objects in the groups branch of the DIT. But if you do this kind of thing, you run into referential integrity problems. People getting added and deleted. Oh, but they're also in a group object out there. Gee, we have to remember to do that. That's not too great. Databases know how to do this stuff. Directories are still learning. Delegating management to people to maintain groups is a win. It's one of the ways you sell this. We're centralizing it. That's a bad thing. But we're giving you back the ability to manage it yourself. That's a good thing. And the ultimate of that is kind of personal groups. That is, give people, as some institutions have, even students, the right to set up a group and then populate it and kick people in and out. Privacy and visibility, even for information about what groups a person is in, is an important issue, and the document talks about that. Group math, I guess the basic idea to get what we mean by this is set operations. That is, I want to allow all the people in this institutionally defined group, let's say a chorus, plus this set of people that I type in manually because they're the TA and an auditing friend of the professors, and then minus these people here who have signed up for the course, but I don't want them to get to this web page because they've misbehaved in the past and hijacked it. So group math is, again, think of it as set operations. And if you work with static group objects, that can be very difficult, if not impossible, to to implement. And so that leads to this next bullet here, which is to say that the recommended way in this groups document to handle this and to make group math, among other things, possible is, yes, you may need static groups for some applications that only know how to deal with that, but at least, and maybe instead, carry in the person entry something called isMemberOf as an attribute. And the values of that attribute are names of groups to which they belong. Then you can start to do the groups math kinds of things. There are still some problems if you get to nested groups, but we'll go on and deal with those as we come to it. There's some good thinking on how to do this nested group stuff, but it's tricky. So good discussion about that. Forward referencing is essentially that business of putting in the names, pointers to the groups to which people belong. That enables something like a referential integrity process to kind of walk through this stuff and make sure it agrees with itself. Namespace issues, if you're generating lots of groups by, the payroll department codes of people and so forth, you've got to have some way of generating names in that hierarchy that will, again, not conflict. Application examples are included in this, and they fall into the categories that you might expect. Access control, one that you might not think of right offhand. Sort of profile and customization attributes that people might want to carry. And one that's controversial, especially with the chair of this panel, is using it for mail groups, for mailing purposes. So there's still work to be done in terms of correcting the thinking of some people. But we're doing that. The next steps for this are the paper that currently exists out there in RPR is very much a theoretical overview. Here are the interesting things you should think about, and the person, Tom Barton, is a mathematician by background, so you can tell. So we said, gee, we need a follow-on thing, a groups implementers guide, or so we now call this work the GIG. And Eileen Shepard, I always say that wrong, Eileen Shepard of Boston College has taken that up as an editorial task. And what we're doing there is talking to our colleagues and to each other about what we've actually done with groups so far, and looking at some of those issues from the previous page and saying, okay, it's time. We've got to actually implement this to support our calendaring operations. So we're going to have to actually choose from all these alternatives. What are we going to do? And compare notes then with each other on how it turned out, or how it seems to be turning out. So that should be a quite interesting document, and there should be some version of it, probably experimental or RPR in the next release. Roles, relations, and access control architecture. That's the space that groups is starting to tread on, as you can see. And people will be dealing and coming into those kinds of questions as we get there. So the question, I think, that is unanswered is exactly how should the directory support the work we want to do in the authorization space. So we'll find out by trying things. We're talking. I think that's another aspect of the kind of evolutionary change. We spend more time talking with shibboleth people and with the folks in VidMid and so forth than talking to each other about how we're doing our directories. What came out from our Birds of a Feather session at Internet 2 in the spring member meeting was that there was a lot of interest in, gee, could you provide a kind of vendor-independent, hopefully open source toolkit for some of these interesting problems you come up with, referential integrity, maintaining that in the face of, gee, I've put something in a forward reference, but I forgot to get it into the group. Could you have something that crawls your directory and make sure that those things are in agreement with each other, kind of good state maintenance tools? And group math utilities. Can you put something in front of a directory so that you could handle nested groups? All that stuff, we've kind of said, okay, you want it, we'll try and do it. And it should be interesting to see how that works. Ken has promised some additional resources in the form of Mead, at least, Mead, to get that work done. Standardization of this forward reference holding attribute called isMemberOf is a work item. That's just a kind of placeholder name for the thing. Microsoft has a member of already and widely distributed. This is something that our technical advisory board is hopefully going to help us with, is thinking about how you would do that. Now, see, notice we're not putting edu person is a member of, because we think this one right off the bat is a good, useful attribute for a lot of things. So we're going to at least explore that approach. Affiliated directories is, you can also just think of this as the directory support for federated or virtual organizations. And so we're in the very early stages here now of scenario development, from which we'll hopefully cook out some common requirements, or at least commonly occurring problem situations. And we're doing things in the scenario area around health organizations, where we try to do identity management as a foundation to be able to do access control for things in the medical area. Some of that will just be, look at what the library folks have done and just change the names of things and get some new entitlements in there. Some of it is trickier, though, because you've got, say, public health officials at the local level, and you want to bring up the information about them or selected bits of that to the state level, and then the CDC would like some subset view of the state level things at the national level. So there are interesting problems there. And you can see how, just from that example, there's some commonality with the multi-campus institutional situation, like University of Wisconsin-Madison. Do we promote some information up to the system level, and so forth? Brendan Bellina from Notre Dame edited a piece that defines some of the practices and some of the bumpy spots in the road in this area. Again, we're going to have that out there. It is out there as a released for public review RPR document in Release 1. We expect this to go a lot further in the next chunk of time, and Ken will be, flogging away to make sure that happens. It's characteristically, just a couple example requirements here that suggest the kind of things that you might run into as you write out these scenarios. That maybe you don't want to have a local store at all. You just want to have some pointers about where to go, some LDAP URLs to go get the bits of information of interest to you, because they may be in several federated directories, and then pull those together at the time you need the information. And when you do that, and you get bits of information coming in from anywhere, then you start to say, gee, I need to know where this came from, how old it is, who do I contact if I think it's wrong? And those are why we think of data and metadata bundles. And again, that's an area that we're actively exploring with our technical advisory board. We're thinking that, again, we're going to nudge into, this is kind of a recurring theme here, we're sliding into the authorization space. Maybe there's even a role for directories in carrying some policy assertions. As R.L. Bob said, there's this notion of XML fragments inside the directory as carrying policy information. We think that maybe the privacy management stuff is not something we'll solve at the directory level, but something that the next layer up, say Shibboleth, for example, will help us solve. There's a directory component to it, but we're not going to try to do the full solution at that layer. And yes, interoperation with the grid approach has this meta computing directory services 2.0 and beyond notion. We're working towards the interoperable problem statement there, but I don't think we've got it yet. We're doing that plumbing business. And I'll just close by saying we've already had great fun finally getting together this group of advisors to join in conference calls where we take some of the thorniest and hopefully most interesting problems and bring them up before the group. We're really fortunate to get folks of the caliber of Kurt Zelinga and Ed Reed and Kim Cameron and Mark Smith. And then there are some folks that are sitting around here that are playing part. David Chadwick is represented here by Sasha Otenko and the work that was described there on the premise system. He's been fun to have on the calls. And Roland Hedberg is a member of this group, as is Peter Dietz. So that's been fun, but the only challenge is, going from the west coast of the U.S. to, I don't know I guess probably it's Roland that's the farthest east time-wise. So it makes it a challenge to schedule. Somebody's got to either get up really early or, work at night. But at any rate, we're having fun with those, and you can trust, even if, as Ken says, we're dumb and foolish, these folks aren't, and they've probably got the nerve to tell us so. So thank you very much. And I think the sun's probably, about right where it should be. Right, Michael? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Keith.
Yeah.
So we still have a couple of minutes for any questions for both Keith and Ken and Roland as well. But any questions? Wait. Okay, Ken.
Keith, are we going to fill out the rest of the DIT besides the people space? We've worked very hard in the eduperson space and now the eduorg space kind of, but there's machines and services and other kinds of things out there. Are we going to DIT them or are we going to not?
Help me. What should I say here?
You need the microphone.
Just, why don't we just adopt the SIM model in toto and say it's done? I was looking for. Okay, Roland. No, I mean I think we will. Where are we going to put COM objects in our DIT, Michael? With groups, we know we're going to have some OUs for that and so forth. We'll go where we have to go, I guess, to solve problems that are brought to us, but they won't be driven by any good directory should have this branch of the DIT. It's more like which applications are we trying to serve today.
And always ask the question of is the enterprise directory the right place to put something? Does it need an application-specific directory? So always ask questions about where it's best to put it. But I think the answer is yes, we will go there. Any other questions out there? Neil, if you could come down.
I'm just wondering, there seems to be some tension between the SIM model and the what I've been hearing about the directory from the last two speakers, and I'm wondering, where does the SIM model fit in the scheme of things at this stage?
The SIM model, I'd be interested to see if other people think this, that it was a very ambitious attempt to do a top-down approach to the problem, defining all the boxes and all the lines, and that takes literally big, huge sheets of paper to print out the whole SIM ER diagram. And I think that's maybe the barrier. So that's a way of incriminating ourselves and saying we're too lazy to read all of it and then pick out the bits that are most relevant to us. That's a terrible answer in a way, but I think in another sense, it's a lot of us think in terms of, the way you actually move things in the world is by finding a wedge with a very thin leading edge. That is, make the cost of trying the first thing very, very low. And then if someone finds some value from putting an institutional directory in place for their mail system, you can push that wedge in a little farther and bring in groups and then serve a few more purposes. And I'm not sure that, SIM wasn't designed to be used that way. SIM is also maybe linked to the whole DEN notion. At least there's some commonality of the people and the problems that we're working on. And network disabling DEN, or what was it? Directory disabled networking. Yes, I love that. I'm not sure it's fair, but there it is. So other answers from folks on the table about the SIM.
Does Peter Geets have a comment on it? I would presume he would.
Well, I also think that it would make sense to first look at what SIM did and then see if it's enough or if the edu realm would need additional stuff. But it's always good to see what is already there as standard. And SIM is not only DEN. It was used for DEN, and DEN might be a realm where it showed its value, what you could do with all these Lego bricks to even define complex things like policy. But you could also use these Lego bricks for defining just the question that came up from Ken right now, a computer, a service, or things like that. It makes sense to look into SIM for these things as well, in my opinion.
Yes.
One question I was wondering about when you were talking about groups was the kind of model you think about on access control. I was trying to imagine if you had a group that you wanted the existence of the group to be secret. And then you have all the members of the group have a publicly visible attribute saying this group exists. Or the other way around, if you want a person to be secret, then you have all these groups pointing to him. I wonder whether is the directory really useful only for public information?
Well, I think, and again, we're just in this tossing around idea stage on this, but that is essentially one of the reasons I am saying I'm not sure that the directory is the place that you want to do the heavy lifting on privacy. If you imagine putting controls that hid that stuff from everyone except, say, the attribute authority in the shibboleth sense, then there could be an attribute release policy around group memberships of a person, or the visibility of a group itself, like the AIDS self-help group probably doesn't want its membership known. I'm trying to imagine a group that doesn't want to be known. That's an interesting one, but I can imagine.
Well, I think there are actually a great many groups that don't want to be known. Yeah. And actually, in the LDAP recipe, in terms of a discussion about one possible implementation for groups, the suggestion is that both static groups and forward referencing groups like is member of should all be kept private.
Right.
And you only control access to that through those applications that should be able to see it.
Right.
Because from our perspective, group membership is a way of figuring out all the classes that a student belongs to. And for us, that's a privacy issue. It's also an issue in terms of meeting federal regulations such as FERPA, where a student can actually elect not to be found in that manner. So to me, the only way to effectively deal with that is to just simply declare that all the groups are in fact private, and then only expose those that you want to explicitly make public or only make them available through the appropriate applications. I think we should thank our speakers. It was great. Thank you. Before we break up, just wanted to let you know that again tonight there's a shuttle bus leaving from Drum Row Village at 6:45, 7:30, 8:15, and 9 o'clock. There is no return. The return is your problem. The taxis from Limerick tend to cost €8 to €10. I also want to note we've made mention of MACE a few times, the Middleware Architectural Committee for Education. We do have European participants in the way of Brian Gilmore and Nancy Verschoren. And I think that it would probably still be desirable to have a Euromace, so I still challenge Terena to develop a Euromace, and then we and the Euromace can get along. And also, please don't forget your evaluations. Thank you very much.
So, the person who asked that question is